Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilley, and in this module, we'll be looking at American national government, the presidency, and the bureaucracy. This week, we're going to be focusing in on the executive branch of the United States Constitution and how we actually enact and enforce the laws that the legislature created. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. So the office of the executive, right, the presidency in the United States is derived from Article 2 of the Constitution. Right? This article of our Constitution, right, the second part, establishes a separately elected president. Right? What that means is that the president is selected by the people. Right? Now, this is done through an electoral college, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But this is a separate thing from the legislature, right? Two separate entities. Right? Our founding fathers, right, and a lot of other countries in the world, when they have their legislature, their executive actually is part of that legislature, right? The parliament has the executive branch built into it. The prime minister, right, the leader of Great Britain, is derived from the Constitution. But here in the United States and in every other country in the world that has a president, right, or this president will be separately selected, right? Completely different election from the legislature. What that means is that there is a separate electoral mandate, meaning that this president has, right, the president has their own mandate, right, their own, right, ability to represent the people. And this is completely separate from the legislature. And adding into the fact that our president serves a fixed term and also our legislature serves a fixed term, right? They both have these separate fixed terms. What this means is that we have a problem of what's called the dual mandate. Right? That means that the president has electoral authority, but so does the legislature. And because they both have a mandate, right, there's a really big question as to who actually has the true will of the people, because they have separate election things, and people often vote for a president from one party and a representative or legislature from the other party. This creates a big mess about knowing who's really in charge, right? But this is actually not a bug of the system, right? This is a feature, right? This is dividing up power. And as we remember, right, in all of our lessons so far, the whole idea here is to keep power divided. So in the United States, right, this still creates a lot of internal tensions, but this is what we legitimately designed this system to do. So, right, this problem of the dual mandate does lead to issues about who actually should be directing the direction of the country, right? Who gets the biggest say in which way the country should go. Right, this dual mandate's a huge problem with the setup of our government, and particularly with this separate election of a president and a legislature. Now, in order to select the president, right, the president is selected in a different way. And we kind of got into this when we talked about voting a few modules back. But the president himself is not directly elected by the people. He is instead elected via this moderating institution of the Electoral College, right, which is kind of a halfway stand, right? It's meant to be kind of a stopgap between just massive populism on the part of the population, but also meant to allow for some fairly direct connections to the people. Now, if we remember, the legislature, particularly Congress, is meant to be that branch that's representing you and me, right? That's our major representative branch. The president, on the other hand, is meant to be a bit more separate from the people, is meant to represent the country as a whole. So to do this, he is elected via this electoral college, right? This separate group of electors that get together and aren't actually bound legally to vote for who they say they were going to vote for. So this, right, creates some differences in how we end up with our president. Now, there are some particular considerations about what you actually have to be in order to become the president. So let's take a look at those right now. So in order to become a president, right, you have to be 35 years of age at least, and you have to be a natural born U.S. citizen. That means that you can't have been naturalized, right? You had to have been born as a U.S. citizen. So you have to have either been born in the United States or born to two American parents. right? That you have to have that particular element in order to be the president of the United States. Now, what's interesting about the president is that due to the vesture clause within the Constitution, the power of the presidency, right, the power of the executive office, is generally considered to rest not in the executive branch or the office of the president, but within the person who occupies that office themselves. Right? This is what's called the unitary executive theory, and this leads to all sorts of political considerations later on. Right, the more power you actually give to a president, the more they actually end up having to disperse it in order to do their job. So what we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the bureaucracy. Now, generally speaking, the president has a few hats that he wears. First and foremost, the president is responsible for the external use of power and security of the nation. Right? So that means he holds really two main jobs. First, he is the commander-in-chief. I keep saying he, but right, I'm just talking about the office of the president, the person occupying the presidency. Right? The president is responsible of the commander-in-chief. Right? They direct the armed forces where they're supposed to go and generally how they're supposed to conduct their operations. Right? They are the ones who are the civilian in charge of our military. But at the same time, they're also responsible for making deals with other countries, right? The president is what we call the diplomat-in-chief. They're the chief negotiator on the international sphere, right, in the international arena for the United States. So on the one hand, right, they deal with foreign countries in a negotiation sort of way, make trade deals, make treaties, etc., but they also, have force, right? They're the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Right, so that's what the president does as kind of the head of state, right? The head of the state in the international sphere, right? The sort of external power projection of the United States. When it comes to internal things, though, right, as the head of the government, it's the president's job to administer our country. And he has several powers that he's supposed to use in order to administer the country, right? He has the ability to veto legislation. He has the ability to appoint people within the bureaucracy, and he has the ability to do some sort of executive decrees and interpret how the laws are supposed to be enacted. So the president, it's his job to keep the government open and functioning and enforcing the laws that Congress makes. But he also has a few roles within the larger part of our society. Right, the president is specifically seen as a morale builder. When things go wrong in this country, it's the president's job to make the country feel better, right? To build us back up. A really good example of this is President George W. Bush after 9/11, right? That event really had the country down, and then he goes to the Twin Towers site, right, the World Trade Center, and gives this big address to the people who are doing all the rescue and recovery work. And this really set the country kind of on a unified path. I know almost 20 years on, right, this doesn't have the same resonance. But back at that time, right, this was really a big deal. Right, he really helped rebuild the morale of the country. So I think that's a really good example of the president doing that particular job. It's also the president's job to really set the political agenda for the country. Right, it's the president's job to say the direction we should go economically, right? The kind of social things we should do, as well as national security sorts of policies, the things we need to be concerned with. So the president kind of sets up the direction of government. It's also his job to persuade not only the people within politics, but also the people outside of politics, the country as a whole, on this agenda. And oddly enough, the president is able to use his platform to essentially push the country in the direction, right? That's what we call the bully pulpit up there, right? The president's able to use his platform to push his agenda and the direction he thinks this country should go. So the president's really kind of got this important societal role he plays outside of his constitutionally mandated role. Now, that's not to say that the president's actually very good at doing that, and I'm not just talking about the current president, I'm talking about all presidents in general. What we generally see is that there are high levels of anger at presidents, right? Presidents don't really usually have very high approval ratings um, during most of their tenures in office. It's pretty much only right when they come in and right when they're going out that their approval ratings are at their kind of highest, or sometimes they're very lowest. And we've seen, especially in the last 30 years, as the country has become more and more divided, politically speaking, right, as the two major parties have sorted themselves out into a strictly conservative and strictly progressive party, that the president has become much more of a polarizing sort of figure. And really, since President Nixon came in, right, we've seen levels of trust in the government and society as a whole really start to tank. Right before Nixon, right before kind of 1972, almost 50 years ago, right, there were high levels of trust within this country and trust in the government. Right, this is a government that had defeated the Nazis, helped build one of the strongest economies the world's ever seen, if not the strongest. So people had high levels of trust. But then Nixon committed crimes while he was in office, and was not actually ever impeached, but threatened with impeachment and stepped down. Right? So we'll talk about how to remove a president in a bit. But this really largely broke a lot of people's trust in the government as a whole. So this, right, we've seen the office of the president become a much more controversial part of the government over the last 50 years. Right, we're very much having a conversation about the role of the presidency right now. Now, when it comes to what the president can actually do, right, the president is constitutionally limited in his powers, but what the president is responsible for, right, they have certain things that they can do, right? The first is that they can sign executive agreements and orders, basically saying how, right, the laws that Congress makes can be turned into regulations and how they are meant to function within the larger part of our society. And as I already mentioned, the president also has appointment powers. He's able to put his people, right? The president is able to put their people into offices to enact laws in the way that the president wants them to be enacted. And at the same time, if the president sees that some people, or that Congress is passing laws that they really do not want passed, they actually have the ability to veto it and, right, abrogate those laws, right? Make sure they don't come into power. Congress has some ability to undo that. They can do that with a 2/3 majority vote, but that very, very rarely happens. Especially recently, there's the president, President Trump, vetoed a War Powers Act thing by Congress, and that maybe is going to create a constitutional crisis, probably kind of a low-key one, but that was really kind of a secondary or tertiary concern at the moment. But the president has the ability to veto laws. The president can also pardon people for having committed crimes. Right? He generally has, right, what's considered executive privilege. He can keep things secret, and he can also, the president has the ability to forgive people of crimes they may or may not have committed in the past. This typically happens at the end of presidential terms and has actually become a much more rare thing since President Reagan. Right, the number of presidential pardons has drastically declined. It's become much more of a political thing. The president also has what we call the take care power, meaning that they can really just do whatever they need to take care of and keep the government functioning. The president also has the duty to inform and convene Congress, right? The president's the one that brings Congress together, and he also has the ability to bring it together. He doesn't have the ability to break it apart, right? That happens regularly based on regular electoral cycles. But the president has the duty to inform Congress about the state of our union, right? So the State of the Union is a constitutionally mandated event. Now, it doesn't have to be what it has become. For most of our history, the State of the Union wasn't an address. It was a letter that the president sent to Congress. And honestly, I think we should probably get back to that. It's just become too big of a pageant. It interrupts my Tuesday night programming, right? People don't really watch it as much anymore, right? Smaller segments of the population watch it. Some people play drinking games about the State of the Union, but it's not really as big of a thing as it used to be anymore. People will kind of just go and read the summaries afterwards if they even care. So perhaps we should just get back to the president sending a letter. It almost looked like President Trump was going to do that this year, or maybe even tweet the State of the Union, which he probably legally could do, and I think would probably be a little bit more interesting. The State of the Union's kind of always been written like a tweet storm anyway, so I think that's kind of the logical conclusion here. So the president does have this duty to inform Congress, but the way that he does that is not mandated. There were, right, for a little while, right, when we were first founded, it became addresses. Then President Jefferson just sent letters, and from there all the way through Woodrow Wilson, it was just letters. Woodrow Wilson started making it an address again, and then some of the following on presidents made it back to letters. FDR made it addresses, right, a public address, and then since then it's been a public address. So this State of the Union is a constitutionally mandated thing. The president does have the duty to tell Congress about the State of the Union. Now, the interesting things. How do you get rid of a president? Now, the president is generally supposed to be kind of above the political process. But impeachment, from its original intent, our founding fathers knew that impeaching would be a very political thing. Right? It doesn't just have to be about crimes. It can be you just don't like the guy. This has been a very rarely used thing throughout our political history. In fact, the first time was done was after the Civil War with Andrew Johnson, who just generally nobody liked. Right? He was mostly removed from office just because nobody liked him. That's the only really successful, not only impeachment, which is the House saying this president needs to be removed, but also he was found guilty during the impeachment trial, which is held by the Senate after a president is impeached. And Andrew Johnson actually was found guilty there and was removed from office. The next attempt at impeachment was obviously Richard Nixon. They never fully impeached Nixon, right? It didn't come to that. Nixon actually was kind of taken aside by Barry Goldwater within his own political party and said, look, man, it's over. You got to leave. And Nixon kind of resigned under protesters, sort of thing. So Nixon was never actually impeached, but he pretty clearly was going to be. So he stepped down and retired. Well, yeah, retired. And then from there we saw the third time it was used. President Clinton was impeached for obstruction of justice and perjury. But when it came to the Senate trial, he was found not guilty. And this was a very highly political process that ended with the Democratic Party in a much more stronger position, oddly enough. President Clinton got reelected. The Republicans kind of were broken a little bit. But the whole legacy ended up just being a mess. And obviously we see this kind of floating around now, especially on the heels of the Mueller report being released last week. Well, actually Thursday. Yeah, so last week at this point. So that's putting a timestamp on this lecture. Right, and we see that these questions about impeachment perhaps bubbling up again with our current president, President Trump. So who knows what's going to happen there. Because it's such a political process, it's very possible that the Democratic Party chooses not to pursue impeachment, even though it might, right? Again, it's a very political process, so it could potentially happen. Right, the House does have a Democratic majority, so they could very well go through with impeachment. But then when it comes to the Senate trial, right, a Republican majority in the Senate, it's highly unlikely that the trial would find President Trump guilty, and you'd even need to know what the articles of impeachment were. So yeah, it's a very political process there. So that's right. The formal constitutional way to remove a president is this impeachment process. But there is one other temporary measure that can be taken, and that's the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. Right? If a president is seen to be unfit for office at any point in time, then a majority of his own cabinet can vote to temporarily remove him from power. Now, this has never been done, but well, it's never been invoked in sort of a malicious way. This has been mostly used for health reasons. When President Reagan got shot, the 25th Amendment kind of came into power a little bit. And then pretty much every president since Reagan has had a small moment when the 25th Amendment has been invoked. Typically, it's about medical procedures. President Bush had a colonoscopy, so Cheney was acting president for like a day. Under Obama, right, he had some medical procedures where he needed to take about a day or two off, so Biden would act as president. It's really not that big of a deal. It's a very temporary process. But it could be a much more, right, if this was using sort of a malicious sort of attempt against a president, right, almost a coup, right, this could create a major constitutional crisis. So it is possible that that could be done. And that is another method to remove a president. And of course, there is, right, the third entirely unconstitutional illegal method that has been used several times to remove presidents, which is assassination. This is not an internal political process thing. This is sort of an exogenous, right, outside the system thing that has happened many times, right? Lincoln, Harding, no, not Harding, McKinley, right? Several U.S. presidents have been assassinated or attempted to be assassinated. And, right, that is a way to remove a president. It's not legal. It's probably not moral, but it is something that does exist out in the world. A lot of other countries have used this as well. Right, this ability to remove an executive by just straight up killing them, or presidents can die in office too. That's happened. So that's out there. That's kind of the informal way of doing it. That's why I didn't write it on the PowerPoint. Right? It's not over there. But right, I mean that is a way to remove a president. But there's really only two legal constitutional ways to do it. You can impeach the president, or you can invoke the 25th Amendment. So let's move on. So there are a few, I don't know, I lump this under what I call presidential controversies, but right, these are just certain things to think about when we're talking about the president. The first is this notion of the War Powers Act. This is something that came in on the heels of Nixon, right, and Watergate and that whole thing. This is basically the ability that Congress has well, our Constitution says only Congress has the ability to declare war. But the president does have the ability to, right, use the military. Right? So the War Powers Act says that the president can do military actions for 60 days without any sort of congressional approval. So if a president can do his action within a certain length of time, then Congress has, right, can't really do anything about it. But Congress does have the distinct ability after 90 days of force to declare the end to that use of force. And right, this is something that actually just came up very recently. Both the House and the Senate invoked the War Powers Act to have the president pull military use out of Yemen, and the president vetoed that. Now, admittedly, I am no constitutional scholar of the United States Constitution. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that seems like that could be a constitutional issue for me. I really don't know how that's going to end up playing out, but that's right. That is showing that Congress is now trying to re-grab some of its authority after this time, and both the House and the Senate actually passed that one. So, right, the Congress does have the ability to limit the president's use of force, even though it's been widely expanded since kind of the 70s. The president also has something called executive privilege. Now, we've heard this one tossed around a whole lot, especially in the wake of the Mueller report, that the president is allowed to keep certain things private, right? He can say, look, or he or she or they, the president can say, this is something that I want secret. We're not going to talk about this. And I'm using executive privilege, and this essentially classifies information. It's very difficult to undo a presidential usage of executive privilege. If the president says something is national security, then you pretty much have to go with that. And Congress has a very little ability to undo that. And we as the public have very little recourse against that as well. So the president can keep a lot of things secret if he wants to. The president also has the ability to create these things called executive orders or executive memoranda. This is the president essentially saying this is how rules should be enforced. Right, executive orders are essentially the president saying, look, executive branch, bureaucracy, this is what I want done. This is how we're going to do it. These are not laws, right? This is just, right, actions. And the thing is, they might be easy for the president to put into place, but they are not easy to keep in force, right? One of the very first things President Trump did is he started unrolling a lot of President Obama's executive orders. Obama loved using executive orders, and Trump undid a whole bunch of those, right? So if Trump starts putting in a whole bunch of executive orders, right, the next president can undo those, right? Any president can either keep them in place or remove them. Just like there's an injunction, right, an official executive order signed by JFK saying that we as the United States do not assassinate foreign leaders. Uh, that was meant to be a dramatic pause, right? When I do that in class, everyone's like, Yeah, from time to time we actually do that, right? We kind of rescind the executive order and put it back into place. Uh, that's just kind of standard operating procedure, and every president does this, right? They have their own directives on how laws should be made, how laws should be enacted, and then they also, right, can retract previous ones, put new ones in, right? So executive orders are very expedient, but they're not very resilient, right? They can be put into place real fast, but they cannot stick. They're really easy to also pull out real fast. And you kind of add all of these things together, and we get this notion that's really emerged over the last 100 years, but especially the last 40 years, of what we call the imperial presidency. That the president himself can operate almost like an emperor within the constitutional order. That it's the president who has pulled all of this power together and become the most powerful branch of government. Right? And as more and more power gets shifted from Congress to the president, it's become even more important for the judiciary to be able to check executive power. So that's why we've seen kind of this ratchet effect of the more power the president has, the more important the Supreme Court becomes, right, as checks on each other. Now, Congress is supposed to be a part of this and is supposed to really be the one driving policy forward, making laws, etc., within our system. But over the last century or so, a little more than a century, right, more and more power has become concentrated within the office of the president itself, making it very difficult to balance this system. And right, as polarization has occurred and more power gets right vested within the office of the president, right, this is right really politicized our entire governance structure. And by politicized, I mean like party politics, not right governance structures, right, leading to kind of an imperial presidency that's difficult to deal with. Right. My soapbox moment here, right? I always think that, right, if you're the guy that's in power, you really would be more concerned with limiting your ability so that the next guy doesn't have that power either. But it seems instead that each president likes to take more and more power for themselves, not concerned with what the other guy is going to do with it. That would just be my personal thought on the matter. But that seems to be the general trend. It's less about limiting the ability of the other party to act, and it becomes more about giving more and more tools for yourself while you're in power, making it even more important to be the person in power, further ratcheting up the political process there, which I think, right, drives a lot of the, well, it does not think, that's pretty well observed, that that's what's driving a lot of our political process now, is that so much power has become concentrated in the hands of the presidency that it's really important to control that power. Maybe if we start rolling back some of that power, giving a little bit more of it to Congress, right, redistributing that balance of power, then maybe, right, the political system can calm down a little bit, right, we can move away from politicization. But that doesn't seem to be the trend right now. One of the other big controversies that's emerged is the president is the person who's responsible for setting the budget. Now, again, in reaction to Nixon, when a lot of these checks on presidential power kind of emerged about 50 years ago, Congress also created a separate budget entity to check the president's math and the president's work. But it is primarily the president who is responsible for laying out a spending plan and a budget for the country. And then it's Congress's job to approve that budget, amend that budget, change that budget. But it's the president who initiates that process. Now, why this kind of gets lumped under controversy for me and in this system is that, largely speaking, over the last 15 years, presidents have been very, very bad about actually doing this. We've pretty much operated under what we call continuing resolutions that just keep, right, basically the same spending levels or the same trajectories going, right, without significantly altering the budget. President Obama was especially bad about this, especially bad about not really submitting budgets. Oddly enough, Trump's been a little bit better about this. The budgets may not be any better content-wise, but at least he's submitting budgets. So this is a bit of a change, right? Almost reclaiming that role. I know it's a little bit odd. We were talking about the president assuming more and more powers, and that budgetary power would seem to be a big one. And right, the weird thing there is that they weren't doing it, but now they seem to be doing it again, raising, right, questions about the power being centralized. Yeah. So the president has a whole lot of powers and has gained more and more powers over the last century, right, creating some issues with the other branches of government. But a president, because there is so much law to be enacted, right, the more power you give to the president and the more you centralize that power, the more you actually the president has to diffuse that power out in creating a bureaucracy. Right? So in order to actually get things done as the president, right, the president requires a staff. Right? And the way that the president builds his staff and organizes his staff and makes decisions can vary wildly between presidents. But what we've generally seen is about 5 or so methods of organizing presidential staffs and decision making. Now, when we're talking about the presidential staffs, right, we're really putting things into 2 separate pockets. On the one hand, there are what we call the White House or the executive office building, right, the executive branch, right, the West Wing, if you will. Not the TV show, but the TV show does a really good job of showing how these things sort of work. These are the people that actually support the president in their day-to-day operations, right? Keep the president on track, doing the things that he wants to do, serving as kind of gatekeepers, making sure that the things that need to get to the president get to the president, but the things that don't need to get to the president get handled at a lower level. These are kind of the professionalized staff that help the president. And then on the other pool, right, this other pool over here, there are the, well, in the British sense, you'd probably call them ministries. Here we call them the departments, right? This is the cabinet. These are the various branches of our government that really go out and enact the laws themselves, right? So it's like the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, Department of Treasury, right? These are the departments, right, whose leaders, right, the heads of those departments are the secretaries who sit on the cabinet. And they meet fairly regularly to, right, go over the president's agenda, right, how laws get turned into regulations and actions within society. So the way the president's going to go about using both the professionalized staff and this kind of political department bureaucracy is going to vary wildly from president to president. But they're going to do this in several different ways. Right, the way they're going to organize this and actually, you know, pick who they're going to be listening to. It's going to be done in a few different, right? Most presidents kind of fall in a couple of these different categories. The first one I want to talk about is called the wheel and spoke method, right? This was very popular under FDR, and as a foreign example and, right, kind of a weird parallel, Adolf Hitler actually organized Nazi Germany in a very similar sort of way. This is what we would think of as a competitive system. Right, where the president or the person at the center of, right, imagine a wheel, right? It's got a little spoke in the center, right, a little thing with each of these little rods going out to a different area, right, like on a tire wheel. Right, and each one of those is going to report directly back to the president. So, right, decision makers all throughout the system are going to come up with their own ideas, right, and they're going to report back to the president. And the president himself is going to pick, right, what the best course of actions, and he's actually going to use the competition between the different spokes on the wheel to, right, try to get kind of the best policy, right? This is a very competition policy sort of driven system where the president holds the central role of the ultimate decision maker. Right. So this is fairly popular, fairly effective, but it's not really all that well organized, right? It causes a lot of duplicated efforts, a lot of friction within the system. Right. So that's kind of a very, it attempts to use that friction to get to the best sorts of outcomes. Right? Very competition based. Arranging it in a different way, right? There's what we would think of as a hierarchy within the system, right? This is when the president still sits at the top, but then he has what you would think of as a gatekeeper underneath him who would really drive that competition. So imagine the spoke and wheel kind of system, but with like a little jut out with the president at the top. And the president doesn't even hear what's going on underneath him. The gatekeeper at the center occupies that hub position, and then gives information up to the president, right? That's a much more hierarchical sort of way of doing this, right? So it almost puts the power, right, the decision-making power outside of the president's hands, and then from there, it gets up to the president, right? Maybe like 2 or 3 options would go up to the president. This was used by Nixon, right? Kissinger really filled that sort of role, right? That central organizing role for Nixon. Both really Reagan, H.W. Bush, and W. Bush all used this, with really the same people occupying all the positions as well. Rumsfeld and Cheney played a large role as kind of gatekeepers and central organizers, really for all 3 of those presidents. Right. That's also a very competitive system of government, right? Of government decision making. Now, on the other hand, there are much more cooperative ways of doing decision making as well, right? What we see here is what we call the collegial system, right? That's kind of our big cooperative way of making decisions. Think of that like the Knights of the Round Table, right? This is what JFK loved. This is also, it seems like, what Obama was using. And what this is you basically get the smartest guys all at a table around each other, speaking equally to each other, trying to come up with the best decisions. Now, this can work really well, but it also has one inherent flaw, right, which is almost a group psychological flaw. When you get a whole bunch of people together in a room working for a common purpose, it's very likely that they're going to arrive at decisions where they're all trying to make each other work together and like each other. This is what we call groupthink. Think about this, right? When you've got a whole bunch of people that want to like each other, they're going to not challenge each other as much. And this can lead to some really bad outcomes. JFK, as our example here, used this to make the Bay of Pigs invasion decision back in the early 1960s, which was just a disaster of a decision. Because everyone wanted to like each other, right? They all like, oh yeah, this is a great choice, right? They all ended up not necessarily being yes men to the president, but they all just wanted to work together and be very collegial and cooperative. And this led to some really bad outcomes. So to fix this, luckily, there is a fix to this. The president assigned what's called a devil's advocate. Right? This is someone whose job is to specifically challenge everything that the group is saying. Right? It is their job to be the antagonist within this system. Right? That is literally their job. So when it came to the decision, right, in the October crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, like most of the group was arguing that they should go to war with the Russians. But the devil's advocate said, wait, take a second, let's step back from this and think about this a little bit more. Thank God for RFK, right? He really walked us back from the brink because he played this devil's advocate role. And that is a very formal position. If you're going to be the devil's advocate, you have to be very trusted by the entire group, that you're going to do your job to make sure that we don't have this groupthink phenomenon emerge. Now, it is also possible to do it in a more informal way. I've heard it called the 10th man. I've called it odd man out or something like that, where basically if 10 guys in a room agree to something, the 11th person, it is their job to argue against it, even if they like the other proposal, right? This is just an informal way of doing the devil's advocate role and position. It's still a very cooperative way of working. You just have someone there to check the decision-making process. That just is a better way of making sure bad decisions don't happen, right? Even, right, if they're able to out-argue the devil's advocate, then you're good to go. But you still need to have someone checking decisions within that system. Right. So in building up a staff to help make decisions, right, presidents can choose kind of who they want. Generally speaking, the president builds up something called his National Security Council, which is really kind of his Game of Thrones is on, so I'm probably using Game of Thrones reference, right? It's kind of his small council with, right, from the larger advisor group that really help him make decisions. This typically includes a national security advisor, sometimes the vice president, sometimes the secretary of state, sometimes the UN ambassador, director of national intelligence, secretary of defense, right? It's kind of a mix and match group of whoever the president thinks is the best people to help him make decisions. Going back to Nixon, right? Nixon just had Kissinger, just his national security advisor, and those two made decisions. Republican presidents usually go more towards the Secretary of State than the UN ambassador, although Bush preferred his UN ambassador to his Secretary of State. That's W, not HW. So within their professional staffs, right, presidents have large particular roles that are filled, right? The chief of staff is perhaps the most important person for the president, right? They're the one that really directs what the president's doing on a day-to-day basis and serve as the primary gatekeeper, making sure that only the really important stuff gets to the president. Now, assisting the president is, right, his executive office, right, what we would call the West Wing, and the Office of Management and Budget, which lives in the old executive office building right across the street from the White House. That's a big fancy blue building in a sea of white buildings. And right, it's kind of the people that inform the president. Like, so if the president was like, what is like, how much cheese does France make in a general year? The OMB would go and research that and give the president an answer. Right? So they exist as kind of like a fact-checking and organizational branch, whereas the executive office kind of does the day-to-day operations. Now, within the executive office, there's also the vice president, who really doesn't have that big of a role, usually isn't that influential within the system. Right? In the political process, the vice president is meant to kind of counterbalance the president when they're running. And the vice president mostly just exists to be there in case the president can't do his job. Now, the vice president does play an executive role in running the Senate, but in the day-to-day executive branch, the vice president doesn't really do much. Mostly just sit there to take over if needed. Now, the vice president can be an influential figure. Look at Dick Cheney, very influential within the W. Bush White House. The counterpoint to that, however, is H.W. Bush. Look at Dan Quayle, didn't do anything. Look at Joe Biden, didn't really do anything. Look at Mike Pence, not very influential. So generally, vice presidents don't do much. They're just kind of there to take over just in case. So the key to understanding the role of the president is actually a relationship between the Congress and the president, right? The power relationship between these two different branches is extraordinarily important. As we already talked about, right, there is this thing called the dual mandate, when Congress has one mandate, electorally speaking, and the president has the other. And they can very legitimately butt heads with each other. So the way that this relationship is set up between the president and Congress is really important to not only the political system in our country, but also the governance structure as well. Now, what you have to remember is that they are actually deliberately meant to have competing constituencies. Presidents represent the nation as a whole, whereas the Congress represent smaller, more localized groups of people. And they're also serving radically different term schedules. 2 years for the House of Representatives, 6 years for the Senate, and 4 years for the president. So each one of those has a radically different, right, picture of politics in mind. So when they're coming into power, when they're running for office, they have to have radically different campaigning styles, right? If you're running for a House of Representatives, if you're running for Congress, you can play extraordinarily local sorts of politics. But if you're running as the president, right, you have to pitch to the entire nation, or at least to larger swaths of the national electorate. So, right, just the way they're running, who they're representing, how long they're serving, very different sorts of things. So the question comes in, who really has the mandate to act, right? Presidents have the ability to influence Congress. Congress has the ability to play politics with the president. What it comes down to is who has the most mandate, who's supposed to be directing the system. And that generally boils down to who has the most political capital, right? Who has the most, points to spend within the system, right? The most influence, and who has the most public approval. So really it comes down to the reputation of Congress and the president within the American system and who seems to have more approval. And lately, like the last 15 years or so, the answer is neither of them really has much approval. So it's really hard to govern and do things when nobody has much approval. So this makes the relationship between Congress and the president very, very difficult. And it makes gridlock within the system not only much more likely, but really a huge part of our system, right? By dividing up power, which is the key to what our government's attempting to do, what our founders wanted, right? This distinct difference in power, right, really is meant to slow down action within the system, which people seem to especially not like that as well. So just the politics of the presidency and Congress and that relationship has become very, very fraught and political over the last several decades as well. All right. So we're going to wrap up by talking about the bureaucracy. All those people out there that are part of the executive branch that are meant to help the president enact the president's will. As more and more power gets concentrated within the president actually has to distribute that back out to his bureaucracy to be able to do the job of governing. So the president and the bureaucracy exist to enforce the laws that are on the books, right? To enact the laws that Congress makes. Generally speaking, Congress's laws, the laws we make, are about outcomes. They're about what we want to occur, but not how we get there. And that's what the bureaucracy exists to do. Right? The bureaucracy itself is meant to make regulations, right? Right above me. We'll get to that in a bit. So the way that the bureaucracy is actually designed is really two separate pools. There's what you call your professional staff, the people that take civil service exams, the ones that are working permanently for government. And then there are your political appointees who are appointed by the president. They're much more politically tied to the system. So you've got the people that do the day-to-day operations, the people that row the boat, right, rowing the boat, and then you've got your political appointees who, steer the boat, right? That's the way I like to think of it. So your professional bureaucrats, they're the ones who are rowing the boat. Your political appointees steer the boat. So keep that metaphor in your mind as we go through this. All right. So the idea of a bureaucracy is creating a set of uniform regulations and procedures that are going to direct actions, right? To make sure that the political system applies evenly to everyone. Right? So bureaucrats are the ones who operate these regularized procedures and regulations. But the more regulation and procedure that you create, the more it comes down to individual interpretation within the system, giving bureaucrats more and more power. Soapbox moment, setting that aside. Now, within the bureaucracy, right, the entire federal bureaucracy is subordinate to the president. They have to follow the president's will. The president of the United States is their boss. Now, I mean, that's really just the core of this. The entire bureaucracy, which is subordinate to the executive branch, it serves at the behest of the president. The president is the one who operates that system. They have to do what the president says. But there's a little bit more leeway within that system for individual bureaucrats to make decisions about how these regulations get enforced. Now, the way that our bureaucracy is established and broken up is into several different categories. The most important of these are what we call our departments. They are run by the secretaries that serve as cabinet members for the president. These are standing institutions of government that directly report to the president via their secretaries, who are, of course, themselves political appointees. These includes things like Justice, State, Defense, Veterans Affairs, Native American Affairs, Treasury. There's a whole host of these. Interior, right? If there's a secretary of blank, then they have a department. There's also these things called independent standalone agencies, right? These things exist to deal with a specific sort of problem. and they're not really part of a cabinet department. They would report directly to the office of the president. These independent standalones really right, are kind of oversight sorts of things, right? They enact wills. Most of our intelligence agencies would be considered standalone agencies. We also have what are called independent regulatory commissions, which regulate stuff, particularly rules within the economy. So things like the Securities Exchange Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Federal Reserve technically falls under this thing, even though it's a private bank. It's a whole separate mess. The Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, NASA, right? These are independent regulatory commissions, right? Their job is to really enact the regulations that Congress, well, to turn the laws that Congress has into regulations and make sure those regulations are applied throughout society and the economy. There are also government-run corporations, right? These are businesses that are owned by the government. So things like Amtrak, right? If you're taking trains up and down the East or West Coast, or taking a train from Hammond to Chicago, that's going to be on a government-owned train. Right? Passenger train service in the United States is pretty much entirely owned by the government. Now, freight rail, that's a completely separate story. But passenger rail, Amtrak, is a government-run company. So is the Postal Service, right? It's a function that's owned by the government, but generally, mostly just delivers our Amazon stuff. Let's be honest. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Sallie Mae, right? These government companies that are meant to give loans to people, right? Those exist as well. They're essentially publicly owned banks that invest in individuals in some way. So the government actually runs businesses too. Now, the people that are employed as bureaucrats generally fall into three types, right? There are the presidential appointees. These are the ones that are actually the political staff, right? They are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. So this is the political people, usually at the top, usually the ones who are making policy within the system. Below them are what we call the senior executive service. These are the top level bureaucrats who have risen up through what we call the civil service. You actually have to take exams and tests to rise to these ranks, right? These are kind of the professional managers within the system. Right. While presidential appointees, these political employees come and go, the senior executive service is the one that maintains continuity of how the government works. And when the political appointees come in, it's the senior executive service that assists them in learning how to actually do things. And finally, the everyday employees are what we call the civil service. Again, they have to take exams to get there. This is theoretically built on something called a meritocracy, where the more intelligent, the better you are, the higher up in the system you can rise. Right, so in order to become a government employee, you have to take exams, civil service exams. Unless, of course, you're an appointee, then you just get appointed. All right, so the civil service, they're the ones rowing the boat. Senior executives are like the executive officer on a ship, and the political appointees are the ones who actually steer the ship, right? They're the captain. Well, I guess technically the president is the captain. So, I don't know. Metaphor there, you know what I'm trying to say. So the question kind of boils down to, what is it that the bureaucracy actually does? First and foremost, number one thing, they're the ones that make regulations. So when Congress passes a law, right, this law says the outcome that they want. It does not say how to get there. And it's the bureaucracy's job to figure out the regulations of how they actually do that law. Right? It's the bureaucrats that figure out how the law should work in practice. So in order to do that, they have to have the ability to raise revenue. Right? It's the bureaucrats that go through and actually do the work of figuring out the math of how do you take the money in, and they're the ones that actually take the money in. And additionally, they're the ones that send the money out. Right? They're the ones who dole out the money to the various government programs. They're the ones that administer taxes, right? Income tax, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, excise taxes. These are how, right, they get their money, get the money for the government to work. They can also sell treasury notes, which is basically a loan, right? The government saying, hey, we're going to pay out more money if you loan us this money right now. So that's a big way of doing it. So in doing this, and we're going to come back to this in a couple of weeks when we talk about the policy process, the bureaucracy figures out how to actually pay for and spend on the various entitlements and mandates, the things that we, right, the money we get from the government, the things the government pays out. It's the bureaucracy that really figures out how to make that work. And additionally, right, the bureaucracy, right, the professional bureaucracy, right, oversees not only the work, but is overseen, right, is watched over by both the president and Congress, right? Both of those have oversight power over how the bureaucracy functions, right? So, right, this can create some kind of fraught things, right? But basically, most of the committees that exist within Congress, and if it's got the word oversight in it, it's overseeing some of the work that's being done by the bureaucracy. So, while the power of the executive and the ability to make and, right, enact laws, well, not make laws, but enact laws, is vested in the president themselves, they need a large bureaucracy to help them do it. So it's, right, really through this method, right, it's on this page, that the president is able to, through their bureaucracy, make the law into practice. Right? Now this can lead to some problems, right? There could be some mismatches between the way that the law is made and the way the law is enforced that need to be examined. So there is a third branch of government that our next module is going to talk about. And the judiciary really seeks to balance how the laws are made and how they're enacted, and then how that impacts us as citizens. So we're going to talk about the judiciary in our next module. So thank you for watching. I know this was a little bit of a longer lesson. We had a lot of stuff to talk about. Most of the lessons are probably going to be about this length moving forward because there's a lot of stuff to get through. So thank you for watching, and have a great day. I will see you in the next lesson.